You ever look around at the world and just ask yourself, like, what is going on? Because sometimes I do, and I look at the corruption and the politicians and the violence and all the needless suffering. And sometimes it just feels like the people who have the most power are the people least concerned with doing anything to fix it. And maybe that's why Daniel chapter 7 is such an important chapter to study, because in it, Daniel is given a vision of what world history looks like, and it's not pretty. He doesn't see endless progress and beautiful kingdoms marching triumphantly into the future. He sees monsters and beasts and violence and rulers who are so into their own glory that they end up causing pain to other people, particularly God's chosen people, Israel. But suddenly, in the middle of that vision, it changes setting, and Daniel looks up and he sees a throne room and he sees an image of God, and it completely changes the way we look at that first picture. So let's take a look at Daniel chapter 7 together. But before, I would just want to let you know that this chapter marks a shift in the book of Daniel. You see, the first six chapters are talking to us about historical narratives or court conflicts that happen in the lives of Daniel or his friends. Each chapter is sort of a self contained story that are simple enough so that even our children can understand them, and some of them are so famous, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the lion's den. But in Daniel chapter 7, things change and we start to receive the visions that Daniel himself saw. And we're moving into kind of a different genre within one book. Whereas the first one were about courtly narratives, this is called apocalyptic literature. And while I can probably make a whole video on just principles that we should use when reading apocalyptic literature, it's important to know that we have to read this section differently than we read the first one. History should be read literally, whereas prophecy is often metaphor rich, symbolic imagery. Oftentimes, we are given a vision of a world falling apart, of cosmic images, of beasts and monsters and cosmological disturbances. We see tons of imagery, oftentimes including numbers or dates or years or the amount of days. And while those images are meaningful, while they convey something true, they don't necessarily convey something precise. What I mean is that we shouldn't press the details so far that we begin to put a meaning on the text that wasn't there to begin with. I don't think that the book of Daniel and other apocalyptic books like Revelation are giving us a precise coded blueprint of exactly what's going to happen in the future so that we could kind of have our curiosity satisfied or guess when certain things are going to happen. The point of apocalyptic literature is not about our curiosity, but to give us hope that the future is in God's hands. Remember, Daniel receives these visions while he is in exile from Judah, captive in Babylon, although God gives him favor in that land. And while he is living under the power of foreign kingdoms and often the brutality of these vicious men, Daniel is given a vision of the future. He gets to see behind the curtain and see what's really going on. So open your Bibles and let's look at this chapter together. So in verse 1, we learn this setting where Daniel had his dream. First, it's in the first year of Belshazzar. So we're going backward in time, as chapter 6 ended with Daniel already being in the Persian kingdom, with Belshazzar dead, with the Persian kingdom having taken over. And we see that Daniel had a vision. And in verse 2, we see the details of Daniel's vision. First, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came out of the sea. So we need to pause here, because in the ancient world, not just Israel, but in the ancient Near East, the sea represented more than just a place where you go to swim during the summer. The sea represented chaos and danger and the unknown. And here we're giving the quintessential setting for a nightmare. It was a dark and stormy night. The winds are blowing. The sea, which is already representing chaos, is even more chaotic and turbulent than usual. And from that chaos begins to emerge four beasts. Now, while there is some speculation about what each beast represents on its own, one thing I think is really important about apocalyptic literature for us to be able to interpret it correctly is to think about what we're meant to feel and not just what we see. So clearly, Daniel would have been feeling terrified at this moment. These images are meant to evoke dread and a feeling that something ominous was coming. So far, the vision is not off to a good start. Let's look at the beasts individually. First, in verse 4, it says, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. That's the first description we get of it. Now remember, these are beasts. These are not lions. So Daniel's not seeing a lion. He is seeing a beast that looks like a lion and also has eagle's wings. And then as he looks, it says that its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. We'll come back to that in just a second. The second beast was one that was like a bear, and this bear is kind of lopsided, raised on one side, 3 ribs in its mouth. This one devours much flesh. The third beast is another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back, 4 heads, and it was given dominion. And the fourth beast was terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It had 10 horns. And from those 10 horns, another horn came, a little one. And this horn had eyes of a man and mouth speaking great things. Now, I can't dive into every single one of these individually. I'm sure more than enough ink has been spilled about this. I'm sure there's a ton of videos, but what I want to come down to is the main thing here. These animals all represent forces that oppose God. Well, how do I know that? Well, number one, they're coming out of the chaotic scene. I've already explained to you that that describes the unknown, this chaotic order, very much so like Genesis 1, where we see that there is chaos and disorder and emptiness prior to God beginning his creation work here on earth. But the beasts themselves have a very interesting quality. With the exception of the bear, most of them are weird mutations, hybrid creatures, kind of something outside of the created order of God. Again, in Genesis, when he creates each creature after its own kind. But here we see that they're mixed, that they're hybrid creatures that kind of oppose God's order. And they get worse as they go along. The fourth beast is not even compared to an animal. Look at the verse again. It's just described as terrifying, dreadful, exceedingly strong. It describes its teeth as made of iron. Later on in verse 19, Daniel will add on that it has claws of bronze. And all these animals do the same thing. They go out and do the things that empires do. They devour, they create violence, upheaval, they crush their enemies and trample over people. Now, these beasts all represent different kingdoms throughout human history, and they have been interpreted in different ways. So from a bird's eye view, the first beast, the lion with the wings, is typically interpreted to be Babylon. It's in the second beast that people begin to deviate the way that they interpret these beasts. The second one is either thought of as the Media Empire or the Medo-Persian Empire. I tend to think it's the Medo-Persian Empire, but there's evidence on either side of those interpretations. The way we interpret the second one determines the way we interpret the third one, because the third beast is typically thought of as the Greek Empire. While the Persian Empire was this powerful force that went and defeated Babylon, defeated Egypt, defeated Lydia, the Greek Empire came and in merely 3 months defeated the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great, a young conqueror, came with great speed and conquered almost all the land. That again would explain why he's described as a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. All of that imagery is about the speed. It's about him moving quickly. In chapter 8, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think it's safe to assume that my interpretation is that this is the Greek Empire. But then the fourth beast is where things get really, really complicated. Some identify the fourth beast with the Roman Empire, which there's evidence for that. Others interpret it as a different kind of beast, a final world empire towards the end of days. And there's evidence for that. I think that there's another possibility that works with either one of those that is worth considering, because Daniel repeatedly emphasizes that this kingdom, this beast, is different from the beast that came before it. which is why I don't tend to think that it's Rome, because Rome is, after all, just another empire, the way the Greek Empire was, the way the Persian Empire was, the way the Babylonian Empire was. Perhaps it could represent a more comprehensive system of world powers, a system that is opposed to God, that has spread throughout all humanity, something that does operate through earthly kingdoms like Rome or a final world superpower, but ultimately is mainly concerned with reflecting a rebellion against God's kingdom and established order. And while we can get kind of lost in the details here, I think it's important to again look at the big picture so we walk away with clarity. Each of these beasts represent some type of worldly kingdom, but all they do is instill dread and bring destruction and bring violence and chaos, pain and suffering. That is what human effort does. God gives Daniel this vision to instill in him a sense of dread, and for us to be able to see that despite us looking at the world around us and maybe thinking of these systems as a good thing, we see that ultimately all they lead to is chaos. That the world is not progressing towards some utopia, and it's certainly not as orderly as we pretend it to be. But then look at verse 9, because that's where everything changes. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, a new figure, a new setting. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. We are no longer by a chaotic sea. Now we're in a courtroom. This is the second scene of the vision, the divine courtroom where God's throne is set up. And I just love that contrast, because where on earth in the first scene, Daniel is seeing beasts and winds and chaotic seas and all this frenzy, in the throne room, in the courtroom, the Ancient of Days is sitting. He is not panicked. He's not scrambling to try to figure out what he needs to do next. He certainly is not surprised by the rise of the beast. He sits. How could he do that when Daniel is probably panicking? Well, look at his description. Clothing white as snow. The hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. This imagery is communicating things about God's character. His clothing and hair talk about his holiness and righteousness. His title, the Ancient of Days, talk about his eternality and his wisdom, and the fire talks about his power and his judgment. And in verse 10, we see thousands and tens of thousands of people ready to serve. The heavenly court is enormous. Daniel can't even describe the number. At first, maybe those beasts looked unstoppable, but here God pulls back the curtain and shows Daniel, look at the throne room of God. The armies of earth may look impressive, but the throne of God is even greater. And while we understand that the beasts on earth had authority, they did not have final authority, because in verse 10, the books are opened and God sits in judgment. And look at verse 11. I love this verse. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. It's like we flash back down to earth. And as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. Just like that, the beast is killed. This horrifying, terrifying creature just dies. And then we move into the third scene of the vision. This is so powerful. In verse 13, it says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. Notice before, the kingdoms were all beasts, but this person shows up and they're in the form of a human. And there is an important point to be made here, because this imagery of someone coming with the clouds of heaven, every single time that that image is used in the Bible, it's referring to divinity, it's referring to God, to Yahweh. And so this Son of Man that is coming is both human and divine at the same time. To us, that sounds like a very easy softball type of question. If I said, who do you think this is? Yes, this is Jesus. But Daniel had no idea who this was. And what happens to this Son of Man, who, by the way, that's the title that Jesus most often uses to describe himself. Well, verse 14 tells us, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Look at the scope of his kingdom. Whereas the other kingdoms had limited scope for a limited time over a limited region, this king, this Son of Man, will have dominion over all peoples, all nations, and all languages. And whereas all those previous beasts all had a limited amount of time, the kingdom of the Son of Man will last forever. And while the rest of the chapter continues to elaborate on the topics that we've talked about so far, I think we can stop here because Daniel chapter 7 is trying to teach us something very important. Daniel does not look at the beasts and say, oh, they're not that bad. He recognizes that they're real, that they're evil, that they're having an effect on this world, that they are destructive, but that they are temporary. That is the perspective that Daniel wants us to have after having read this vision. Because if you only look at the beast from the ground level, if you stopped before we got to the throne room, we would live our lives full of anxiety and fear and terror. If you only watch the news, you're going to be convinced that the world is a horrible place that is spinning completely out of control. If you just look at social media, there's going to be so many pressures from different places trying to make you think that all is lost. And while it is true that we are suffering both out there and in here, while it is true that our brothers and sisters in Christ in other places around the globe are facing real persecution, laying down their lives, not in the figurative sense, but in the literal sense for the gospel, we know that these things are real. But Daniel chapter 7 is inviting us to look higher, to look beyond the events of visible history, because while the beasts are real, the throne is also real. The time of the beast is limited because the Ancient of Days is sitting on the throne today. And our vision of the future should be more clear, more hopeful than the vision that Daniel had, because Daniel did not see here that Christ would one day come, that Son of Man would come, both human and divine, and defeat death on the cross, defeat the power of sin, leave an empty grave behind, and promise us a hope for a future. That final kingdom, that rock that destroyed the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2 has come. His kingdom has been inaugurated, and while we're still waiting for its full consummation, we are sure that the final battle has already been won. And while the world feels chaotic and while evil seems rampant, this chapter is inviting us to see the scene behind the scene. The Ancient of Days is on the throne, the Son of Man comes with the clouds, and his kingdom is everlasting. Thanks for watching. I hope you were blessed by this. My name is Eric. We love to study the Bible here, and if you do too, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos like the one that's coming out next about Daniel chapter 8, where we get another vision and more beasts. See you next time.